Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make you deeply grateful for your modern kitchen. We're diving into what medieval people actually ate, and I need to warn you up front. It was absolutely, spectacularly awful. Forget the feast scenes from Game of Thrones or the cozy taverns in fantasy movies. The reality of medieval food was grim, dangerous, and would probably violate several health codes and qualify as a war crime under the Geneva Convention. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because we're about to explore a world where your next meal wasn't just uncertain, it was probably trying to kill you in a dozen different ways. Picture this. You wake up in the year 1347. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? You're about to eat something that would make a modern health inspector faint and probably call for backup while reaching for their emergency whistle. Your kitchen isn't a kitchen at all. It's the corner of your single-room hovel where you also sleep, work, and occasionally give birth. The walls are wattle and daub, a fancy way of saying sticks held together with mud and animal dung, and they're about as effective at keeping out the cold as a screen door on a submarine. These walls tell the story of medieval construction priorities. The wattle is made from thin wooden strips woven between upright stakes, creating a basket-like framework. The daub is a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and yes, animal dung, usually from whatever livestock you can afford to keep. The dung isn't added out of perversity. It's actually an effective binding agent that helps the mixture stick together and provide some insulation. But it also means your walls literally smell like a barn, especially when it rains and the moisture reactivates the odor. The roof above you is thatched. Layers upon layers of straw, reed, or whatever plant matter could be gathered and bound together. When new, it's reasonably waterproof and provides decent insulation. But thatch degrades quickly, becoming home to insects, rodents, and birds. After a few seasons, it starts to leak, sag, and occasionally drop bits of rotting organic matter onto your dinner. Your floor is packed earth, dirt that's been trampled and compressed over months or years until it's hard as stone. But unlike stone, it's porous, absorbing spills, blood, vomit, and whatever other fluids daily life produces. This floor is never truly clean. You might sweep it occasionally with a bundle of twigs, but this just moves the dirt around. The floor becomes a geological record of your family's struggles. Layers of spilled food, tracked in mud, animal droppings, and bodily fluids compressed into a surface that's part foundation, part archaeological site. At the center of this smoky, dim reality hangs the most important object in your medieval life, a large iron cauldron suspended over an open fire. This pot is never empty, never clean, and never not bubbling with something that barely qualifies as food. It's your stove, your refrigerator, your dishwasher, and your only hope of not starving to death before Tuesday. The fire beneath this cauldron is your lifeline. Maintaining it requires constant attention and precious fuel. You burn whatever you can find: wood scraps, dried dung, peat if you're lucky enough to live near a bog. The smoke from this fire has no proper chimney to escape through. Maybe there's a hole in the roof, or maybe the smoke just finds its way out through gaps in the thatch and walls. Either way, your home is perpetually filled with acrid, stinging smoke that makes your eyes water and coats everything in a fine layer of soot. This constant smoke serves several purposes, none of them pleasant. It deters insects to some degree, though it never eliminates them entirely. It helps preserve any meat you might hang in the rafters, though this smoking process is more accidental than intentional, and it slowly, steadily, fills your lungs with particulates that will likely contribute to your death from respiratory problems if something else doesn't kill you first. The cauldron itself is a massive investment, perhaps the single most expensive thing your family owns. Made of iron forged by the village blacksmith, it represents months of savings and careful budgeting. This isn't a pot you replace casually. Families pass these cauldrons down through generations, and losing one to cracking or warping is a genuine catastrophe. This cauldron contains what historians call pottage, and before you start imagining some hearty medieval stew, let me stop you right there. This isn't comfort food. This is the opposite of comfort. This is food that actively makes you uncomfortable while you eat it. Pottage begins with whatever grain you've managed to grow on your tiny strip of land, usually oats or barley, coarsely ground into grit that would make modern coffee grounds seem refined. The grinding happens at the Lord's mill, where the miller takes his cut and adulterates what remains with whatever cheap filler he can find. Sometimes, when harvests are particularly bad, your grain is just the sweepings from the mill floor. Grain dust, chaff, mouse droppings, and whatever else was on the ground when someone took a broom to it. Into this base of questionable grain goes water from the local stream. The same stream where animals drink, people relieve themselves, and the local tanner dumps his chemical waste. This water is brown, smells faintly of decay, and contains microscopic life forms that are actively plotting your demise. But it's the only water you have, so into the pot it goes. Then come the vegetables from your small garden plot, withered peas that never properly developed, tough leeks that are more white fiber than green leaf, cabbage leaves that have seen better months, and turnips so woody they could double as building materials. Nothing is washed beyond a cursory dunk in that same contaminated water. The dirt clinging to the roots isn't removed. It's seasoning, adding that distinctive gritty texture that will slowly wear down your teeth over the years. You might occasionally find wild herbs while gathering firewood, nettles that sting your hands as you pick them, dandelion greens so bitter they make your face pucker, or wild garlic if you're extraordinarily lucky. These aren't added for their bright, herbaceous flavors. They're thrown in for the vague hope that they might contain some nutritional value your body is desperately craving. The resulting mixture is a grayish, lumpy porridge that tastes primarily of despair with undertones of mud and smoke. The texture varies from day to day. Sometimes it's thin enough to drink, other days it's thick enough to use as mortar for building repairs. You don't so much chew it as process it, feeling each gritty spoonful slide down your throat like liquid disappointment. But here's the truly medieval part. This pot is never fully emptied. You eat your evening meal, and whatever remains becomes the base for tomorrow's pottage. It's the original perpetual stew, except instead of developing complex, rich flavors over time, it just gets progressively more questionable. This means you're eating a soup that contains traces of meals from weeks, possibly months ago. That slightly sour cabbage from 3 weeks back, it's still in there, contributing its essence to tonight's dinner. That turnip that was already past its prime when you added it last month, its ghostly presence lingers in every spoonful. It's like a time capsule of every disappointing meal you've ever had, all simmering together in perpetual mediocrity. The taste is overwhelmingly bland, with a persistent undertone of smoke from your constantly burning fire and an occasional tang of fermentation when the weather's been warm. The dominant flavor note is what you might generously call grain water, with subtle hints of root vegetables that have given up on life. Sometimes you throw in wild herbs, not for flavor, but for the desperate hope that they might contain some nutritional value your body is crying out for. On very rare occasions, if you're incredibly lucky, you might have a bit of salt to add, but salt is expensive, worth its weight in silver, so you use it sparingly, if at all. More often, your seasoning consists of whatever herbs you can forage that don't appear to be actively poisonous. This is your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is what medieval people built their lives around. This is what kept entire civilizations functioning. And frankly, it's a miracle anyone survived long enough to invent better food. The pottage sustains you in the most basic sense. It provides calories and some minimal nutrition, but it does so grudgingly, like a miser parting with coins. Every meal is the same. Every day brings the same gray, steaming bowl. The only variation comes from the seasons. Spring might bring some early greens. Summer might offer a few fresh vegetables. Autumn could provide nuts or late fruits. And winter brings nothing but the slow diminishment of your stores. But through it all, the pottage remains constant, reliable in its blandness, dependable in its disappointment. This is survival eating at its most basic level. There's no consideration for pleasure, variety, or even adequate nutrition. The goal is simple: consume enough calories to have the energy to work so you can produce more food to make more pottage. It's a closed loop of culinary despair that defines the medieval peasant experience. And yet, as terrible as this sounds, you're grateful for it. Because in a world where famine is always just one bad harvest away, even bad food is better than no food. The pottage may be bland, gritty, and monotonous, but it's yours, and it's keeping you alive. In the harsh calculus of medieval survival, that's more than enough. Your pottage needs a companion, and that companion is bread. But once again, I need you to completely forget everything you know about bread. This isn't a crusty artisan sourdough with a perfect crumb structure, or even a simple white sandwich loaf. What sits on your wooden table is a dense, dark, heavy round that looks like it was carved from stone and has roughly the same edibility. This is maslin bread, a mixture of whatever grains you could grow and afford, usually wheat and rye together, though often it's just rye when times are hard. The name comes from maslin, meaning mixed grain, and it represents the practical reality of medieval agriculture. You grow what will survive in your soil and climate, not what tastes good. The flour isn't the fine, powdery substance you know from modern baking. It's a coarse, gritty meal full of bran, husks, and things that really shouldn't be in flour, but ended up there anyway. Medieval milling was a crude process that couldn't separate the wheat from the chaff with any precision. The result is flour that contains everything: the nutritious parts of the grain, yes, but also the indigestible fiber, the bitter husks, and whatever debris happened to be mixed in during harvesting and processing. The color of this bread tells the story of your social status as clearly as any coat of arms. Your dark, heavy loaf immediately identifies you as a peasant, someone who works with their hands, someone who cannot afford the luxury of refined flour. The lord of the manor eats manchet bread, made from the finest sifted wheat flour, so white it looks like clouds, so soft it would dissolve on your tongue. You've seen it carried up to the great house on feast days, and it might as well be food from another planet. But even getting your rough bread made is a complex process fraught with opportunities for exploitation. You don't have your own oven. That's a luxury beyond imagination for someone of your station. Like everyone else in your village, you're legally required to use the Lord's communal oven. This is called a banality, one of those delightful feudal obligations where you pay for the privilege of using something you helped build, but don't own. The Lord built this oven, maintains it, and provides the fuel for it. In exchange, you must pay a fee every time you use it, usually in the form of a portion of your dough or a small payment in coin. You can't simply decide to build your own oven even if you had the resources. That would be illegal, a violation of the Lord's monopoly rights. This arrangement means your bread is made for longevity, not pleasure. The communal oven is fired up perhaps once or twice a week, when there's enough demand from the village to make it economically worthwhile. You must coordinate with your neighbors, prepare your dough when the schedule permits, and then wait in line for your turn. The entire process might take most of a day, and you're at the mercy of the baker's schedule and temperament. The loaf you're eating today could be 2 weeks old. Fresh bread is a memory that lasts about a day before it begins its inevitable transformation into an increasingly dense, hard object. By the end of its first week, it's no longer really bread so much as it is a bread-shaped stone that happens to be technically edible. But the age is the least of your problems. See, everyone in the bread-making chain, from the miller to the baker, is looking for ways to increase their profit margins. These aren't acts of particular malice. They're survival tactics in an economy where everyone is one bad harvest away from starvation. The miller might add sand to bulk up your flour. Not a lot, just enough to increase the weight without making the adulteration obvious. Sand is free, abundant, and heavy. A few handfuls mixed into each batch can significantly increase his profits over the course of a year. The fact that this sand will slowly grind down your teeth like sandpaper is not his concern. Chalk dust is another favorite additive. It's white, which helps disguise its presence in flour, and it's readily available in many regions. Like sand, it adds weight without adding value, except for the value it adds to the miller's purse. Your digestive system can't process chalk, so it passes through you unchanged, providing bulk but no nutrition. Sawdust from the mill floor is perhaps the most common adulterant. Mills produce a lot of wood dust from the constant grinding of the wooden gears and mechanisms. Rather than dispose of this waste, it's often swept up and mixed into the flour. It's organic, it's roughly the right color, and it's free. The fact that it's completely indigestible and provides no nutritional value is irrelevant to the miller's calculations. Sometimes cheaper grains are substituted for more expensive ones. If you've paid for wheat flour, you might receive rye flour cut with barley meal. If you've paid for rye, you might get oats mixed with pea flour. These substitutions aren't necessarily harmful, but they're forms of fraud that reduce the nutritional value of your food while maintaining the price. In times of extreme scarcity, even more creative substitutions appear. Bean flour might be mixed in, not necessarily harmful, but it gives the bread a strange taste and texture. Dried and ground peas serve the same purpose. Acorn flour, made from acorns that have been processed to remove their bitter tannins, sometimes makes its way into the mix. The baker, too, has his own opportunities for profit. He might use a different measure when portioning out dough than the standard one required by law. He might bake loaves that are technically the right weight when hot and fresh, but lose significant moisture as they cool, meaning you're paying bread prices for water weight. He might use inferior ingredients in his dough, knowing that most customers won't be able to tell the difference until they get home. The result of all this systemic adulteration is a loaf that contains more non-bread ingredients than actual grain. You can feel it as you chew, a persistent, low-level grittiness that never goes away. Your teeth, which were never going to have an easy life in the medieval world, face a constant assault from the sand, chalk, and other inedible materials mixed into your daily bread. By the time you're 30, your teeth will be noticeably worn down, flattened by years of grinding through what amounts to flavored masonry. A toothache in your world isn't an inconvenience you can fix with a trip to the dentist. It's a potential death sentence. Dental abscesses can lead to blood poisoning, and there's no effective treatment available. Many people die from tooth problems that would be trivial to treat in any modern dental office. Because the loaf is so old and hard by the time you eat it, you can't simply bite into it like modern bread. You use your knife, the same all-purpose blade you use for everything from mending tools to cleaning your fingernails, to saw off a piece. This isn't easy. The bread has become so dense and hard that cutting it requires real effort. Sometimes you have to soak pieces in water just to make them soft enough to cut without breaking your knife. Then you dunk the chunk of bread into your bowl of pottage, letting it soak up the thin, greasy liquid until it becomes a sodden, heavy sponge. This is how you make the bread and the pottage into a single, cohesive meal of brownish, gray mush. The flavors, the sourness of the rye bread and the blandness of the grain porridge, merge into the singular taste of survival. You eat slowly, methodically, working each gritty, soggy mass around in your mouth before swallowing. There's a strange alchemy in this process. Two bad things combining to become something that's not exactly good, but at least filling. The bread provides bulk and some nutrition, the pottage provides liquid and whatever vegetables you've managed to include. Together, they form a meal that keeps you alive, even if it doesn't make you happy. There's a social hierarchy to bread that perfectly encapsulates medieval society. The whiter and finer your bread, the higher your social status. The Lord's white manchet bread represents purity, refinement, and proximity to the divine. Your dark, coarse Maslin bread represents earthiness, labor, and distance from God. This isn't just practical, it's theological. The great chain of being, the medieval understanding of cosmic order, extends even to grain products. But even your terrible bread is better than no bread at all, and as winter deepens and your stores run low, that's exactly what you're facing. The brown loaf on your table, hard as it is and gritty as it tastes, represents security. Each slice is a day you won't starve. Each crumb is a small victory against the constant threat of famine that hangs over medieval life, like a sword suspended by a thread. When you hold that dense, dark bread in your hands, you're holding the product of a year's labor. The planting, tending, harvesting, threshing, and processing of grain. You're holding the result of negotiations with the Lord, arguments with the miller, and transactions with the baker. You're holding a food that connects you to the land, to the seasons, to the social structure that defines your life. It may not taste good. It may wear down your teeth and fill your stomach with indigestible bulk. But it's yours. And in a world where ownership is a luxury few can afford, that matters more than flavor. The last of your soggy bread and thin pottage settles in your stomach like a stone, and you're acutely aware of something terrifying. There's almost nothing left. The grain sack in the corner of your hovel, which seemed reassuringly full after the autumn harvest, now sags empty and pathetic. The salted fish are gone, the dried peas are finished, and you're entering the most feared time of the medieval year, the hungry gap. This is the cruel period between late spring and early summer, roughly from May to late June or even July, when last year's food stores have run out, but this year's crops aren't ready for harvest. It's nature's cruelest joke. Outside, the world is exploding with life. Green shoots pushing up through the earth, birds singing, days growing longer, everything seeming to promise abundance. But for you, this explosion of life is torture, because none of it is edible yet. The terror of the hungry gap isn't sudden. It's a slow, creeping dread that begins in the depths of winter and builds with each passing week. You've been rationing for months, cutting daily portions of pottage smaller and smaller, adding more water to make it stretch further, scraping the bottom of grain sacks for every last kernel. Now the rationing has reached its inevitable conclusion. There's simply nothing left to ration. Your stomach, which has known a constant low-level ache for months, now clenches with sharp, insistent pain that makes it difficult to concentrate on anything else. The village, usually a place of quiet but steady activity, has grown eerily quiet. People move more slowly, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes taking on the hollow look of the chronically malnourished. The usual sounds of children playing and women chatting as they work have been replaced by an ominous, desperate silence. You can see the effects everywhere around you. Your neighbors, people you've known your entire life, are becoming shadows of themselves. Their clothes hang loose on frames that are shrinking daily. Their skin takes on a grayish pallor, and their hair begins to thin and lose its color. Children who were energetic just months ago now sit listlessly, their bellies beginning to swell with the telltale signs of severe malnutrition, a condition called kwashiorkor that you know only as the bloating sickness. The psychological effects are as devastating as the physical ones. Hunger doesn't just make you weak, it makes you obsessed. All thoughts center on food. You find yourself staring at things you would never normally consider edible. The leather of your shoes, wondering if it could be boiled into something resembling nutrition. The straw in your mattress, thinking about whether it might contain some digestible fiber. The bark on trees, remembering stories of people who survived famines by grinding it into a flour-like substance. You feel dizzy when you stand up too quickly, your body struggling to maintain blood pressure without adequate nutrition. Your hands shake slightly, and you notice that small cuts and scrapes take much longer to heal than they used to. Your body is beginning to consume itself, burning through what little fat reserves you had, and then starting on muscle tissue. This is the beginning of starvation, and you can feel it happening with each passing day. The vulnerability of the medieval food system becomes starkly clear during the hungry gap. There's no global supply chain to rescue you, no emergency food reserves, no way to import grain from regions that had better harvests. You're entirely dependent on what your small community can produce and successfully store. A single bad harvest, caused by too much rain, not enough rain, plant diseases, or pest infestations, becomes a community-wide catastrophe. The Little Ice Age, a period of climate cooling that begins in earnest in the 14th century, makes these disasters more frequent and more severe. What might have been once-in-a-generation harvest failures become regular occurrences. The hungry gap transforms from an annual period of mild scarcity into a yearly nightmare of potential starvation. Your daily routine becomes an endless, desperate calculation of calories. You know exactly how many spoonfuls of pottage are left in the pot, how many crumbs remain from the last bread, how many dried peas are hidden in the bottom of the sack. Every morsel is accounted for, rationed out with the precision of a miser counting coins. The mathematics of survival become the organizing principle of your entire existence. You begin to consider options that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The seed grain stored for next year's planting starts to look less like future security and more like present survival. Eating the seed grain is an act of ultimate despair. It means choosing to live today by sacrificing any hope of tomorrow's harvest. But when your children are wasting away before your eyes, the future becomes an abstract concept that can't compete with the immediate reality of starvation. The social fabric of the village begins to fray as hunger takes its toll. Neighbors who once helped each other begin to eye each other with suspicion. That turnip root you've been saving, is it safe from the family next door, who might be even more desperate than you are? Community cooperation, normally the backbone of peasant survival, gives way to a more primitive instinct for self-preservation. There's even a term for this period of illness and weakness: June sickness. A catch-all description for the listlessness and physical breakdown that strikes communities during the hungry gap. It's not a specific disease, but rather the cumulative effect of prolonged malnutrition. Your immune system, compromised by lack of food, makes you vulnerable to any passing illness. A simple cold that you might have shrugged off in autumn could now develop into fatal pneumonia. A small cut that would have healed quickly now becomes infected and refuses to close. Meanwhile, the lord of the manor and his family remain well-fed. Their granaries are vast and well-protected, their contents reserved for the noble household and their retainers. You can see smoke rising from the manor house kitchen, and you know that up there people aren't just surviving, they're dining on roasted meat, white bread, and imported delicacies. The injustice of it is sharp and bitter, but you're too weak from hunger to feel the anger fully. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach smothers every other emotion. Historical records from Hungry Gap periods show mortality rates spiking dramatically, especially among the very young and the elderly. Children under 5 and adults over 60 are the first to succumb, their bodies unable to cope with the stress of prolonged malnutrition. Parish records from these periods read like casualty lists, with entire families sometimes disappearing from the village rolls within a matter of weeks. But it's not just death that marks the Hungry Gap. It's the way starvation changes people. Chroniclers write of the madness of hunger, describing how prolonged starvation affects the mind as well as the body. People begin to make irrational decisions, taking desperate risks for tiny amounts of food. They might travel dozens of miles on the rumor that another village has surplus grain, only to find the same desperate conditions everywhere they go. The green shoots in the fields become objects of obsession. You know exactly how many weeks remain until the earliest crops might be ready for harvest. First the leafy greens, then the peas, finally the grain crops that will end the Hungry Gap. But those weeks stretch ahead like an eternity when you're not sure you have enough strength left to survive them. Some people try to supplement their diet with early shoots and buds from trees, but these are often indigestible or even toxic. The urge to eat something, anything, green and growing can lead to poisoning from plants that aren't meant for human consumption. The line between food and not food becomes blurred when survival is at stake. Looking at your own children, their limbs growing thinner by the day, their eyes too large in their gaunt faces, you feel a terror that goes beyond simple hunger. This is existential dread, the knowledge that the most basic requirement for life is slipping away, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You would do anything, risk anything, sacrifice anything to put food in their bellies. And as the Hungry Gap deepens, anything begins to include possibilities that you never thought you would consider. The Hungry Gap reveals the fundamental brutality of medieval life, that survival was never guaranteed, that prosperity was always temporary, and that the line between life and death could be measured in spoonfuls of pottage and crumbs of bread. It's a reminder that for most of human history, the simple act of eating enough food to stay alive was a daily struggle that claimed more lives than war, disease, or any other cause. The pot is empty, the grain is gone, and desperation drives you out of your hovel and into the woods. The hunger has evolved beyond a mere physical sensation. It's become a living entity that consumes your thoughts, your dreams, your every waking moment. Your body craves protein, fat, iron, the dense, life-giving substance of meat. The memory of it haunts you, the rich taste, the satisfying weight in your stomach, the way it seemed to restore your strength from the inside out. Foraging becomes more than just a supplemental activity. It's a matter of life and death, a high-stakes gamble where the wrong choice doesn't just mean a bad meal, it means a horrific death. You leave at dawn with a rough burlap sack and eyes that scan constantly, the ground, the trees, the undergrowth, looking for anything that might be edible. This isn't the peaceful communion with nature that modern foraging enthusiasts might imagine, nor is it a trendy farm-to-table experience. This is a desperate treasure hunt where the treasure is a handful of calories and the penalty for failure is watching your family starve to death. The morning mist clings to the forest floor as you make your way along paths you've known since childhood, but they look different now through the lens of desperation. Every plant becomes a potential meal, every root system a possible source of sustenance. Your knowledge of edible plants is a patchwork of inherited wisdom, folk tales, and dangerous guesswork passed down through generations of equally desperate foragers. You start with the safe bets, the plants your grandmother showed you, the ones that generations of hungry peasants have relied upon when the crops failed. Stinging nettles are among the first you gather, their heart-shaped leaves covered in tiny hairs that inject formic acid into any skin they touch. You've learned to pinch them carefully through a piece of cloth, rolling the leaves between your fingers to break the stinging hairs before dropping them into your sack. When boiled long enough, nettles lose their sting and provide a bitter but edible green that contains more nutrition than many cultivated vegetables. Dandelions are another staple of desperation foraging. Every part of the plant is theoretically edible, the leaves, roots, and even the flowers. Though edible is a generous term for something so intensely bitter, it makes your face involuntarily pucker. You dig for the roots with sticks or your bare hands, following the taproot deep into the earth to extract every possible bit of nutrition. The roots are the most valuable part, containing some carbohydrates that can help fill your empty stomach, even if they taste like concentrated bitterness mixed with earth. Wild garlic is a prize find when you can locate it, its pungent aroma a shocking explosion of flavor in your bland world. But it's not common, and when you do find it, you have to be absolutely certain of your identification. Several poisonous plants look similar to wild garlic, and the consequences of misidentification are swift and deadly. But these familiar plants aren't enough to sustain you. They're wisps of nutrition, flavoring for your desperation rather than substantial food. The real calories you need lie in more dangerous territory: roots, tubers, and other plant parts that require more specialized knowledge to identify and prepare safely. You search for pig nuts, small nutty tubers that grow wild in woodlands and taste remarkably good when you can find them. But they're maddeningly difficult to locate. You have to trace their thin, delicate stems down through the leaf litter into the earth, carefully excavating around them with sticks or your hands, hoping to unearth the small brown prizes. Finding one pig nut is a moment of genuine triumph, but you'd need to find hundreds to make a meaningful contribution to your family's diet. Wild parsnips represent both opportunity and mortal danger. The edible wild parsnip looks remarkably similar to several deadly poisonous plants, including hemlock water dropwort, a plant so toxic that a single root contains enough poison to kill a cow. The poison works by attacking the nervous system, and its most notorious symptom is something called the sardonic smile, a rictus grin that freezes on the victim's face as they die in agony. Every white root you dig up forces you to make a terrible choice. Risk starvation by being overly cautious, or risk poisoning by gambling on uncertain identification. You've heard the stories whispered in the village. Entire families found dead after making pottage with the wrong white roots, their faces frozen in that horrible grin that gives the poison its name. Mushrooms present perhaps the most complex foraging challenge of all. You know a few species that are safely edible, large field mushrooms that grow in the common pasture, with their brown caps and dark gills that are hard to mistake for anything dangerous. But in the dim, damp light of the forest, dozens of other species sprout from rotting logs and leaf litter. Some are delicious and nutritious, others will make you violently ill for days, and a few will kill you slowly and agonizingly. The deathcap mushroom is particularly cruel in its method. After eating it, you'll feel fine for a day, maybe two. You might even congratulate yourself on finding such a substantial meal, sharing it with your family and feeling hopeful about surviving another day. Then the violent stomach cramps begin, followed by vomiting and diarrhea that seems endless. But by the time symptoms appear, the amatoxins have already begun destroying your liver and kidneys. You're doomed to a slow, agonizing death over the course of several days, all because hunger made you gamble on a pale mushroom in the damp forest understory. You stare at clusters of mushrooms growing from rotting logs, your stomach roaring with emptiness, and you have to make impossible calculations. The pale caps could be oyster mushrooms, delicious, nutritious, safe. Or they could be something far more sinister. Your botanical knowledge is a desperate mixture of half-remembered folklore and wishful thinking, filtered through the fog of prolonged hunger that makes clear thinking nearly impossible. Folk wisdom provides some guidance, but it's often unreliable. The old saying, "If it's white, it's not right," might keep you from eating some deadly species, but it would also prevent you from eating perfectly safe mushrooms. Other traditional tests, like the belief that poisonous mushrooms will tarnish a silver coin, are completely useless based on superstition rather than any understanding of chemistry. Some desperate foragers turn to what historians call famine foods, substances that can technically be consumed but require extensive processing to become even marginally edible. Acorns are the most common of these. Oak trees produce thousands of acorns each fall, and they're loaded with carbohydrates. The problem is the tannins, bitter compounds that make unprocessed acorns inedible and can cause serious digestive problems. Processing acorns into something edible requires days of work and considerable water. You have to shell them, grind them into meal, then leach the tannins out by repeatedly soaking and rinsing the meal in running water. The process can take a week or more, and the result is a bland, gritty flour that can be mixed into pottage or formed into primitive cakes. It's nutrition, but it comes at the cost of enormous labor and time you might not have. Tree bark represents another famine food, though calling it food is generous. The inner bark of certain trees, particularly birch, pine, and aspen, can be scraped off, dried, and ground into a flour-like substance. This bark flour can be mixed with other ingredients to extend precious grain stores, but it's largely indigestible and provides little nutrition. It fills your stomach and makes you feel less hungry, but it's essentially roughage that passes through your system unchanged. Even more desperate is the consumption of various mosses and lichens scraped from rocks and trees. These organisms can theoretically be eaten, and some do contain small amounts of nutrition, but they're difficult to digest and can cause severe intestinal distress. They're foods of absolute last resort, things you eat when the only alternative is death from starvation. The psychological toll of foraging for survival is devastating. Every plant you consider becomes a question of life or death. Every mushroom is a gamble with your family's future. You find yourself standing in the forest, holding a root or leaf, trying to remember half-forgotten conversations with your grandmother about which plants are safe and which will kill you. The weight of these decisions is crushing. Choose wrong, and you don't just harm yourself, you doom your children. The constant stress of making these life-or-death botanical identifications in a state of severe hunger takes a toll on your mind as well as your body. Malnutrition affects cognitive function, making it harder to think clearly just when you need your wits most. Your hands shake as you examine plants, not just from weakness but from the terrible responsibility of each choice. Sometimes you resort to testing methods that are more superstition than science. You might rub a plant on your skin to see if it causes irritation, though many deadly plants cause no external reaction. You might taste a tiny amount and wait to see if it burns your tongue, but this test misses many toxins that have no immediate taste effects. These folk methods provide some psychological comfort. They make you feel like you're being careful, but they're far from reliable. You return home as dusk falls, your sack heavy with uncertainty. The contents represent hours of desperate searching, wilted greens that might be edible, muddy roots that could be food or poison, handfuls of bitter leaves that will at least add bulk to the empty pottage pot. You empty everything into the cauldron, adding precious water from the contaminated stream, watching as a thin, swampy-smelling soup begins to form. The unidentified leaves and roots swirl in the murky water, and you realize you've just created a botanical roulette wheel. Some of these plants will nourish you, others might make you violently ill, and a few could kill you outright. But hunger has made you reckless, or perhaps fatalistic. You're so weak, so desperate, that the risk of poisoning seems acceptable compared to the certainty of starvation. As the mixture bubbles over your fire, filling your hovel with an earthy vegetal smell, you try to remember every piece of plant lore you've ever heard. Did your grandmother say the white-flowered plant was safe? Or was that the yellow one? Was it 3 leaves that meant poison? Or 5? The details that seemed so clear when your stomach was full now blur together in a haze of hunger and desperation. You're not just eating plants, you're eating uncertainty, consuming hope mixed with terror. Each spoonful of this foraged soup could be salvation or doom, and you won't know which until it's too late to matter. This is the brutal reality of survival foraging. It's not about finding delicious wild foods to supplement your diet. It's about gambling with your life every time you put something in your mouth. The forest that once seemed like a potential source of salvation now feels like a vast, green casino where the stakes are life and death, and the house always has the advantage. You're playing a game where the rules are written in languages you don't speak. Botanical Latin, chemical formulas, evolutionary adaptations that developed over millions of years to keep exactly what you're trying to do from happening. But you play anyway, because the alternative is watching your family waste away. You gather the questionable plants, you make the desperate soups, you take the terrible risks. Because when survival is on the line, even a dangerous gamble is better than certain death. Your thin soup of foraged plants hasn't killed you, but it hasn't nourished you either. The hunger has evolved beyond a mere physical sensation. It's become a living entity that consumes your thoughts, your dreams, your every waking moment. Your body craves protein, fat, iron, the dense, life-giving substance of meat. The memory of it haunts you, the rich taste, the satisfying weight in your stomach, the way it seemed to restore your strength from the inside out. But the most readily available source of meat, the deer stepping gracefully between the trees, the wild boar grunting in the underbrush, the rabbits and squirrels that seem to mock you with their plumpness, is utterly, absolutely forbidden. You stand at the edge of the great forest watching life teem all around you, and you might as well be looking at the crown jewels. This isn't just food you can't afford. It's food that will get you killed if you try to take it. This is the reality of forest law, a brutal legal system that transformed vast swaths of England into royal hunting preserves where the king's pleasure took precedence over peasant survival. The forest wasn't just wooded areas. Entire communities, villages, farms, and settlements could fall under forest law jurisdiction. By some estimates, nearly a third of England was designated as royal forest at various points during the medieval period. The punishments for violating forest law weren't fines or brief imprisonments. They were designed to serve as terrifying deterrents that would be remembered for generations. Kill a deer, and you could be blinded. Your eyes put out with hot irons while you were held down by the king's men. Take a wild boar, and you might lose your hands, severed at the wrists with an axe while the village watched. Repeat offenses or particularly serious crimes, like killing a royal stag, the most prized of the forest animals, could earn you a hanging, your body left to swing from a tree as a warning to others. Even minor infractions carried severe penalties that could destroy your life. Cut down a tree for firewood without permission and face a brutal flogging that might leave you unable to work for weeks. Gather fallen branches after a storm and risk heavy fines that could bankrupt your family. Own a dog large enough to potentially chase game, and the animal had to be lawed or expedited, a charming legal term for a process where 3 claws were cut off one of the dog's front paws, crippling it permanently to ensure it couldn't run fast enough to hunt. The message was crystal clear and brutally enforced. Everything in the forest, every animal, every tree, every fallen branch, belonged to the king and the nobles he granted rights to. Touch any of it without permission, and you would pay with your flesh. The forest was not a resource for the common people. It was the king's personal pantry and playground, maintained for his exclusive pleasure while peasants starved just outside its boundaries. The hypocrisy and injustice of the system were staggering. The lord of the manor and his guests would conduct elaborate hunting parties, massive affairs involving dozens of men, packs of specially trained hounds, and all the pageantry of a military campaign. They would ride through the forest with horns blaring and banners flying, pursuing deer through the same woods where a peasant could be executed for taking a single rabbit. In a single afternoon's sport, they might kill more deer than your entire village could eat in a year. Not from hunger or necessity, but for the thrill of the chase and the prestige of serving venison at their feasts. You've witnessed these hunts from a distance, hidden in the underbrush like the very animals they pursue. The sight of such casual waste while your own children grow thin with malnutrition creates a rage so pure and hot that it threatens to consume you. But that rage is tempered by fear, because you know that even watching the hunt from too close a distance could be interpreted as hostile intent. The irony is that your labor maintains the very system that denies you its benefits. As a peasant bound to the manor, you're required to provide days of unpaid work to maintain the hunting lodges, clear the riding paths, and even help with the hunts themselves. You might spend days building stands for the nobles to watch from, repairing the kennels for their hunting dogs, or beating the bushes to drive game toward their arrows. You participate in creating the spectacle of abundance that is forever denied to you. But desperation breeds ingenuity, and the threat of death by starvation sometimes outweighs the fear of death by execution. You become a creature of shadows, learning the darker arts of survival that hover at the edges of the law. You can't hunt deer. The risk is too great, the animal too large to conceal, the penalty too severe. But you can focus on what the nobility contemptuously called vermin, the smaller creatures that are still illegal to take, but might not attract as much attention if you're caught. Setting snares becomes your specialty, a skill you develop through trial and error, desperation sharpening your focus. You learn to read the forest like a book, identifying the paths that rabbits use regularly, the burrows where they shelter, the feeding areas where they're most likely to be found. Rabbit runs are surprisingly predictable. These animals are creatures of habit, using the same routes night after night with the reliability of commuters. Your snares are crude, but effective devices made from whatever materials you can scavenge. A bit of strong thread or thin rope if you can get it. More often it's strips of leather cut from old shoes or clothing, twisted plant fibers, or even hair pulled from your own head and braided into cord. The snare itself is a simple slip knot positioned at rabbit height along a known path, anchored to a sapling or stake driven into the ground. The art lies in the placement and tension. Set too high, and the rabbit passes underneath unharmed. Too low, and it might catch a leg instead of the neck, leaving you with a wounded, screaming animal that will alert every forester within miles. Too loose, and the rabbit escapes. Too tight, and the noose won't close properly. You learn these lessons through failure, each empty snare a masterclass in the physics of desperation. You check your snares in the pre-dawn darkness, moving through the forest like a ghost, your heart hammering with a mixture of hope and terror. Most mornings bring only disappointment, empty loops swaying in the morning breeze, sprung by falling leaves or small birds. But sometimes, rarely, you find success. A rabbit hanging lifeless in your snare, its neck caught cleanly in the tightened loop. The moment of finding a successful snare is a complex emotional experience. First comes triumph, the surge of relief and gratitude that comes with securing protein for your family. But this is immediately followed by pure primal fear. You are now in possession of the king's property. Every second you spend in the forest with this illegal cargo increases your risk of discovery and the terrible punishment that would follow. You work with swift, practiced movements born of desperation and repetition. The rabbit is quickly killed with a sharp blow to ensure it's dead. A wounded, struggling animal makes noise that could attract attention. Then it's stuffed inside your tunic, its still warm body pressed against your skin. The weight of it feels precious and damning at the same time. Life-giving protein that could also cost you your eyes or hands if discovered. The walk back to your hovel is the longest journey of your life, even though it might only be a few hundred yards. Every shadow could conceal a forester. Every sound could be the approach of the Lord's men. Every bird call could be a signal between forest guards. You move carefully but not too slowly, trying to look like a peasant going about normal business rather than a poacher fleeing a crime scene. Your knowledge of the forester's patterns becomes crucial to your survival. You learn their schedules, their preferred paths, their habits and weaknesses. You know which areas are patrolled heavily and which are sometimes neglected. You understand the difference between the official foresters, the king's appointed guardians of the forest law, and the local men who might be sympathetic to your plight or susceptible to small bribes. Some foresters are zealous enforcers who see catching poachers as a path to advancement and reward. Others are local men who understand the reality of peasant life and might look the other way for a small consideration or out of simple human sympathy. Learning to distinguish between these types becomes a crucial survival skill, as dangerous in its way as learning to identify poisonous mushrooms. The rabbit provides more than just a single meal. It becomes the centerpiece of an elaborate deception designed to conceal your crime. Back in your hovel, the atmosphere becomes thick with conspiracy as your entire family participates in erasing the evidence. The rabbit must be skinned quickly and efficiently, every part used, all traces hidden. The hide presents the greatest challenge because it's the most identifiable evidence of your crime. It can't simply be thrown away where it might be discovered. Instead, it must be burned completely, reduced to ash that can be scattered or buried. This burning usually happens at night when the smoke is less visible, fed into your cooking fire piece by piece to avoid creating a sudden, suspicious blaze that might attract attention. The internal organs, the heart, liver, kidneys, stomach, are processed immediately. Nothing can be wasted when protein is this precious, and every part has value. The organs are either cooked right away for immediate consumption or preserved by salting if you have any salt to spare. Even the bones are valuable, boiled for hours to extract every bit of nutritious marrow and gelatin. But the real challenge lies in concealing the meat itself. You can't simply roast a rabbit over your fire. The smell of cooking meat would travel for hundreds of yards, an aromatic advertisement of your crime that would reach the nostrils of neighbors who haven't tasted meat in months. Such an aroma would immediately raise questions that you couldn't answer without incriminating yourself. Instead, the rabbit meat must be chopped into tiny, unrecognizable pieces and hidden within your usual pottage. The familiar gray gruel becomes a camouflage, disguising the precious protein among the vegetables and grain. When cooked this way, the rabbit's flavor disperses throughout the entire pot, enriching the bland porridge with a meaty richness that transforms the entire meal. As you eat that night, you search desperately for the tiny morsels of meat hidden in your bowl, each small piece a treasure worth more than gold. The flavor, rich, savory, intensely satisfying after months of bland plant matter, seems to restore something essential to your body and spirit. You watch your children as they eat, seeing color return to their cheeks, energy return to their movements, life return to their eyes. The irony is bitter and perfect. The king's forest provides the very sustenance that keeps his peasants alive to work his lands. But accessing that sustenance is a crime punishable by death. You are surrounded by abundance but forced to live in scarcity, watching plenty rot on the branch while your children waste away from hunger. The forest that should be a source of life becomes a symbol of oppression, its beauty marred by the knowledge that every animal within it represents both salvation and damnation. And yet, as you finish the last spoonful of rabbit-enriched pottage and feel strength flow back into your weakened body, you know with absolute certainty that you will do it again. The risk of blindness, mutilation, or death pales in comparison to the certainty of watching your family starve. Tomorrow you will set your snares again, check your traps again, gamble with your life again. Because in the harsh calculus of medieval survival, even the king's justice is preferable to the king's forest's indifference. You would rather die trying to feed your children than live watching them die of hunger, while abundance remains forever just out of reach. The illicit rabbit provided a momentary surge of strength, but it did nothing to solve your other fundamental problem: staying hydrated when your only water source is actively plotting your demise. The physical demands of your daily life, working in the fields from dawn to dusk, the energy required to forage and set snares, the stress of constant hunger, create an unrelenting need for fluids. But quenching that thirst safely is one of the most dangerous daily activities in your medieval existence. You're constantly, naggingly thirsty. The salty, preserved foods that make up whatever variety exists in your diet, the physical labor that leaves you drenched in sweat, and your body's simple biological need for hydration create a demand that must be met somehow. But the local water supply represents a more immediate threat to your life than wild animals, brigands, or even the king's foresters. The village well, if you're fortunate enough to have one, was dug by community effort and maintained through collective labor, but maintained is a generous term for what amounts to occasional attempts to fish out whatever has fallen in: dead animals, human waste, rotting vegetation, and debris of every description. The well water has a persistent brown tint that no amount of settling seems to clear, and it carries odors that range from merely unpleasant to actively alarming. More commonly, your water comes from the stream that runs past your settlement, and this watercourse serves as the community's multi-purpose utility channel. Understanding what happens to this stream before it reaches your water bucket is crucial to understanding why medieval people developed such elaborate alternatives to drinking water. Upstream from your village, other communities use the same stream for all their water needs. They wash their clothing in it. Months of accumulated sweat, dirt, food stains, and bodily fluids scrubbed out with harsh lye soap and rinsed into the current. The water downstream from a washing day runs gray with soap and brown with the filth of an entire village's laundry. The village tanner, an essential craftsman whose work provides leather for shoes, belts, and other necessities, dumps his process water directly into the stream. Tanning requires numerous chemical treatments: lime for removing hair, tannins from oak bark for curing the hides, and various other substances that turn animal skin into leather. The wastewater from tanning operations contains high levels of organic matter, chemicals, and the decomposition products of animal tissue. This waste gives the water a particularly foul smell and an oily appearance that can persist for miles downstream. The local butcher, when there's an animal to slaughter, usually during the autumn slaughter season, uses the stream to rinse away blood, offal, and the various fluids that come with processing a carcass. The water runs red for hours after a slaughter, and the organic matter from butchering operations provides food for bacteria and other microorganisms that thrive in the increasingly polluted water. But perhaps most significantly, the stream serves as your community's de facto sewage system. The concept of sanitation as we understand it simply doesn't exist in medieval rural life. There are no sewage treatment plants, no understanding of bacterial contamination, no systems for safely disposing of human waste. Instead, people relieve themselves in cesspits dug near their homes, crude holes in the ground lined with stones if they're lucky, left unlined if they're not. These cesspits inevitably overflow during heavy rains, which are frequent in the climate you're living through. When they overflow, their contents spread across the ground, seep into the soil, and eventually make their way into the groundwater and surface water that feeds your stream. The result is that your drinking water contains a concentrated mixture of human waste from dozens or hundreds of people upstream from you. Animals contribute their share to the contamination as well. Livestock, cattle, pigs, goats, chickens, wander freely through medieval villages, and they defecate wherever nature calls them. Much of this animal waste ends up in the stream system, either washed there by rain or deposited directly when the animals come to drink. The concentration of fecal matter in medieval water sources is staggering by modern standards. All of this biological waste creates the perfect breeding ground for the microorganisms that cause waterborne diseases. E. coli, salmonella, cholera, typhoid, dysentery. The medieval water supply is a virtual theme park for every bacterium and parasite that has learned to exploit human and animal waste as a vector for transmission. To a modern person with a modern immune system, a single cup of this water would be a guaranteed trip to the emergency room. You know, on a visceral level, that this water is dangerous. You've seen the evidence repeatedly throughout your life. People, especially infants and the elderly, are frequently struck down by what you call the flux, violent, bloody diarrhea that can drain the life from a person in a matter of days. The flux is particularly cruel because it often strikes the weakest members of the community first: babies, pregnant women, the elderly, and those already weakened by poor nutrition. You don't understand germ theory. That revolutionary concept is still centuries in the future. Instead, you attribute these illnesses to bad air, corrupted humors in the body, or divine punishment for sin. The idea that invisible creatures in the water are causing disease is beyond the scope of medieval understanding. But you do make the crucial connection through observation and bitter experience. Drinking too much from the stream, especially during the hot summer months when the water runs low and becomes more concentrated with contamination, often leads to sickness and death. So what alternatives do you have? The answer sits on your rough wooden table in a large earthenware jug. Ale. Specifically, what historians call small ale. A weak, barely alcoholic beverage that serves as the primary drink for people of all ages, from infants to grandparents, consumed from morning until night. This represents one of the most counterintuitive aspects of medieval life. People, including young children, drank alcoholic beverages throughout the day not to get drunk, but because alcohol was safer than water. The brewing process provided a crucial service that had nothing to do with intoxication and everything to do with survival. Brewing ale begins with boiling water, a process that, unknown to medieval brewers, kills most of the dangerous pathogens lurking in contaminated water supplies. The sustained heat required to extract fermentable sugars from grain effectively sterilizes the liquid, eliminating the bacteria and parasites that make water so dangerous. Then, the fermentation process introduces yeast, which competes with harmful microorganisms for nutrients and produces alcohol, which further inhibits the growth of dangerous bacteria. But let's be absolutely clear about what this medieval ale actually was, because it bears little resemblance to modern beer. This wasn't the hoppy, complex craft beer that modern drinkers might imagine. Hops, which give modern beer its characteristic bitter flavor and help preserve it, weren't widely used in English brewing until the 15th century. Your ale was an unhopped fermented grain beverage that tasted like what it essentially was: liquid bread. The flavor was cloudy, yeasty, and had a slightly sour tang from the natural fermentation process. It was made from barley, oats, or wheat, whatever grain was available and affordable, and the taste reflected the quality and type of grain used. Barley ale had an earthy, nutty flavor. Oat ale was smoother but less flavorful. Wheat ale, when it could be afforded, was considered the finest and had a cleaner, more refined taste. The small ale that constituted your daily drink was made from the second or even third rinsing of the grain mash after the stronger ale had been extracted. This process, called party-gyle brewing, maximized the use of expensive grain by extracting multiple batches of varying strength from the same ingredients. The first extraction produced strong ale that might be 6 to 8% alcohol, reserved for special occasions and those who could afford it. Your small ale was the weaker subsequent extraction, containing only 1 to 2% alcohol, sometimes even less. This low alcohol content was crucial. It was strong enough to provide some antimicrobial effect and to indicate that the fermentation process had worked properly, but weak enough that you could drink it throughout the day while working in the fields without becoming intoxicated. You needed to stay functional while staying hydrated and alive. The production of ale was almost entirely the domain of women, and the brewster, or alewife, was a crucial figure in every medieval community. These women possessed the specialized knowledge of fermentation, the skill to judge when ale was ready for consumption, and the business sense to manage what was often their primary source of income. When a batch of ale was ready for sale, the brewster would signal its availability by hanging a broom, bundle of straw, or decorated pole, called an ale stake, outside her door. This practice is considered by many historians to be a direct ancestor of the modern pub sign. The quality of ale varied dramatically from one brewster to another, and a village might have several women competing for customers. Some produced clear, flavorful ale that provided genuine refreshment and commanded premium prices. Others created cloudy, sour concoctions that were barely palatable but still safer than water. The The worst brewsters might produce ale that was infected with harmful bacteria or contaminated during the brewing process, making it almost as dangerous as the water it was meant to replace. Medieval communities took ale quality seriously because bad ale could be as deadly as bad water. Town and village regulations often specified standards for ale production, and brewsters could be fined, put in the stocks, or banned from brewing if their product was found to be substandard. The ale conner, or ale taster, was an official position in many communities, someone responsible for testing and approving ale before it could be sold to the public. You start your day with a mug of this cloudy, yeasty liquid, the tangy flavor cutting through the grogginess of sleep. You carry a small barrel or large flask of it to the fields, where it provides hydration during the long hours of agricultural labor. You drink it with your meals, using it to wash down the dry bread and thin pottage that make up your diet. Even your children drink it, usually watered down to reduce the already minimal alcohol content, but still providing safer hydration than the contaminated well water. To modern sensibilities, giving alcohol to children sounds shocking and irresponsible, but in your medieval context, it's a logical act of parental care and medical wisdom. Better for your child to consume a slightly alcoholic beverage that won't cause deadly diarrhea than to drink water that could kill them within days. The small amount of alcohol in weak ale is far less dangerous than the bacteria and parasites in your local water supply. The ale provides more than just safe hydration. It's also a source of calories and B vitamins that your limited diet might otherwise lack. The yeast used in fermentation contains nutrients that help prevent deficiency diseases, and the grain-based beverage provides energy in the form of carbohydrates. In many ways, ale serves as liquid food, supplementing your meager diet with both hydration and nutrition, but ale production requires resources that are often in short supply. The grain used for brewing is grain that can't be used for bread, creating a constant tension between the need for safe drinks and the need for solid food. During times of scarcity, families must choose between having enough bread or having ale to drink safely. Often, the compromise involves brewing very weak ale from minimal grain, producing a barely fermented liquid that provides some safety benefit while conserving precious food resources. The seasonal nature of brewing also creates challenges. Ale doesn't keep well for long periods, especially in warm weather when harmful bacteria can multiply rapidly, even in fermented beverages. This means that ale production must be ongoing throughout the year, requiring constant attention and regular supplies of fuel, water, and grain. During the summer months, ale might only stay fresh for a few days, while winter batches could last weeks or even months. So you drink your sour, cloudy ale with gratitude, not because you enjoy the taste, though you've grown accustomed to it over a lifetime, but because it represents one of the few things in your life you can consume without immediate fear of violent illness. It's your shield against the invisible poisons lurking in the well, your daily defense against the waterborne diseases that have claimed the lives of neighbors, friends, and family members. As you raise the wooden mug to your lips and taste the familiar tang of fermented grain, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest survival strategies. You're using the same biological processes that preserve food, fermentation, to create a beverage that allows you to stay hydrated without dying in the process. It's not elegant, it's not particularly pleasant, but it works. And in a world where so little works reliably, where so much conspires against your survival, that's more than enough. For weeks, the village has been buzzing with an unusual current of hope and anticipation. Word has traveled down from the manor house like a rare beam of sunlight penetrating the constant gray of your existence. The Lord's eldest daughter is to be married. For the nobility, this represents months of careful negotiation, dowry arrangements, political alliance building, and the commissioning of elaborate clothing and jewelry. For you and your fellow peasants, it means something infinitely more precious: the possibility of meat. The upcoming wedding isn't just a social event, it's a political necessity for your lord. A successful marriage alliance can bring new lands, military support, trade advantages, and enhanced prestige. But it also requires a display of wealth and generosity that demonstrates the Lord's power and secures the loyalty of his subjects. This is where you come in. Not as guests at the wedding, of course, but as recipients of the Lord's calculated benevolence. Your feudal lord, in what passes for magnanimity in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, will grant a boon to his peasants. This isn't motivated by kindness or genuine concern for your welfare. It's a practical investment in the human resources that make his wealth possible. He needs you healthy enough to work his fields, strong enough to pay your taxes and rents, and grateful enough to remain loyal to his rule. More importantly, he needs you alive and spiritually invested in praying for his daughter's happiness and his new son-in-law's prosperity. The anticipation builds as the wedding day approaches. You've seen the preparations at the manor house, carts arriving daily with supplies, servants scurrying about with increased urgency, smoke rising almost constantly from the kitchen chimneys as elaborate dishes are prepared. The contrast between the abundance visible at the manor and the scarcity of your own daily existence creates a tension that's almost unbearable. When the great day finally arrives, it dawns with unusual fanfare for your normally quiet village. Instead of the typical pre-dawn trudge to the fields, you and your neighbors mill about the village center with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The children, despite their weakened condition from months of poor nutrition, seem to sense the possibility of something extraordinary happening and display more energy than they've shown in weeks. Then you see it, a cart rumbling down the hill from the manor house, escorted by several of the lord's men-at-arms, and carrying what appears to be your lord's gift to his grateful serfs. The cart is covered with rough cloth, but the smell emanating from it tells you everything you need to know. This is meat, more meat than your village has seen in months. But you must abandon any fantasies you might harbor about receiving choice cuts of beef or tender roasted fowl. The prime portions, the tenderloins, the legs of lamb, the choice ribs of beef, the plump capons, are all destined for the high table at the wedding feast. They will be roasted to perfection, basted with expensive wines, and seasoned with spices that cost more than your family earns in a year. What's piled in the cart heading toward you is quite literally the Lord's table scraps. The offal. Offal, a word that encompasses all the internal organs and less prestigious parts of slaughtered animals, represents the medieval equivalent of industrial waste. To the refined palates of the nobility, these organs are considered coarse, unworthy of gracing a proper feast table. But to you, weak from a diet of watery pottage and gritty bread, this offal represents concentrated protein and fat that could mean the difference between your family surviving the winter or succumbing to malnutrition-related illness. As the cloth is pulled back, your eyes scan the bloody, steaming pile with the intensity of a jeweler examining precious stones. You see hearts, deep red, muscular organs that will provide iron and protein, livers, dark and rich with vitamins that your body desperately needs, kidneys, slightly smaller but dense with nutrition, lungs pale and spongy, less appetizing but still edible. There are lengths of intestines, coiled like rope, that will need extensive cleaning but can be turned into sausage casings or fried until crispy. You spot stomachs, large pale sacks that once emptied and cleaned can be used as containers or stuffed to make primitive haggis. Perhaps there's a severed head or two, complete with brains that can be scrambled or added to pottage for richness. Trotters, pig's feet, that can be boiled for hours to extract gelatin and create a nourishing, if unappetizing, jelly. Every single piece represents calories, protein, and nutrients that your family hasn't seen in months. To squeamish modern sensibilities, this might seem like an insult rather than a gift, being offered the scraps that weren't good enough for the Lord's table. But to you, this offal represents treasure beyond measure. Your mouth actually waters at the sight of it, your body recognizing these organs as concentrated sources of the iron, vitamins, and protein it's been desperately craving. This isn't garbage. It's salvation in the form of glistening, bloody abundance. The distribution process becomes a carefully managed chaos. The Lord's reeve, a stern man whose usual job involves yelling at you about your plowing technique or the state of your tax payments, oversees the allocation of organs with the gravity of a judge dispensing justice. There's no orderly queuing system, no polite please and thank you. This is medieval resource distribution at its most raw, a tense, jostling affair where every family pushes and maneuvers for access to the best pieces. You manage to secure a dark, glistening liver, easily the size of both your fists together, and a lengthy section of small intestine that will require hours of disgusting but necessary cleaning. The liver alone represents more concentrated nutrition than your family has consumed in weeks. Rich in iron, vitamins A and B12, and dense with protein, this single organ could restore strength to your weakened bodies and bring color back to your children's pale faces. But claiming your portion is only the beginning of the challenge. You clutch these organs against your chest like precious cargo, their blood soaking through your rough woolen shirt, and hurry back to your hovel before anyone can attempt to snatch them away. The weight of them feels simultaneously precious and urgent. You're carrying food that could save your family's lives, but only if you can process it properly and quickly. Now comes the real work, transforming these raw organs into edible food before they spoil. This isn't simply a matter of throwing some liver in a pan and calling it dinner. The hygiene standards of your cooking area, which is to say, the corner of your single room with the smoky fire, are virtually non-existent even by medieval standards. But offal requires immediate attention and careful handling if it's going to nourish rather than poison you. These organs spoil with terrifying speed, especially the liver and other highly vascular tissues. Without any form of refrigeration, in the warmth of your heated hovel, bacterial growth begins within hours. The liver is already developing that faint, metallic smell that signals the beginning of decay. If you don't process it within the next few hours, this precious gift will become a dangerous liability that could sicken or kill your entire family. The intestines present their own unique challenges. They must be thoroughly cleaned of their contents, a revolting but absolutely necessary process. You take them to the stream, the same contaminated water source you won't drink from, and begin the nauseating work of flushing them out. You squeeze the semi-digested matter from the long tubes, producing a foul-smelling greenish paste that represents the final meals of the slaughtered animal. The smell is indescribable, a combination of decay, fermentation, and concentrated animal waste that makes your eyes water and your stomach heave despite your hunger. But you persist, rinsing the intestines again and again in the cold, dirty stream water, working your fingers along their length to ensure every trace of contents is expelled. This cleaning process is crucial. Improperly cleaned intestines will give your final dish a distinctly fecal flavor that even desperate hunger can't make palatable. Once the intestines are as clean as you can make them, they serve multiple culinary purposes. They can be cut into sections, braided together, and fried until crispy, a dish that would later be known as chitterlings. The crispy, fatty result provides concentrated calories and a satisfying texture that's completely different from your usual soft, mushy diet. More commonly, the cleaned intestines serve as natural sausage casings. You don't have much to stuff them with. Your meat supplies are limited to the organs you've just received. But you can chop up some of the tougher pieces like lungs or heart, mix them with whatever grain meal you can spare, add wild herbs for flavor, and create a primitive form of sausage. This allows you to stretch the meat further while creating a food that's easier to preserve and portion out over several meals. The liver requires different handling altogether. Being more tender and flavorful than the other organs, it's often cooked simply and consumed quickly. You slice it carefully with your all-purpose knife, trying to create portions that will be fair for each member of your family, while maximizing the cooking efficiency. Liver cooks fast, too much heat, and it becomes tough and chalky, too little, and it remains dangerously undercooked. You cook the liver directly over your fire, either on a flat stone that you've heated in the flames or impaled on sharp sticks that can be held over the coals. The smell that fills your small hovel is intoxicating, a rich, iron-heavy aroma that represents everything your usual pottage lacks. It's the smell of abundance, of proper nutrition, of meals that actually satisfy rather than merely filling space in your stomach. Fat from the cooking liver drips into the fire, causing it to hiss and spit while releasing even more of that glorious meaty scent. Your family gathers around the fire with an intensity usually reserved for religious ceremonies, watching every drop of fat, every bubble and sizzle of the cooking meat. The anticipation is almost painful. You've been dreaming of this moment for months. There are no proper plates in your household. Such luxuries are far beyond your means. Instead, the cooked liver is divided up and served on thick crusts of your hard, stale bread. These bread trenchers serve as both plate and food, soaking up the precious juices from the meat and becoming part of the meal themselves. After a lifetime of eating dry, flavorless bread, having it saturated with rich liver juices transforms it into something approaching palatability. The first bite of liver is a revelation that threatens to overwhelm your senses. After months of bland, unseasoned grain porridge, the intensity of properly cooked organ meat is almost shocking. The texture is dense and slightly grainy, completely different from anything in your normal diet. The flavor is overwhelmingly rich and metallic, with an almost creamy quality that coats your mouth and seems to satisfy cellular-level cravings you didn't even know you had. You eat slowly, not from any sense of refined dining etiquette, but because you want to savor every morsel, knowing that this experience might not come again for many months. Each bite seems to restore something essential to your body. You can almost feel your strength returning, your energy levels rising, your body's desperate nutritional needs being met for the first time in ages. The historical reality of medieval offal consumption reveals the sheer variety of animal parts that were considered not just edible, but essential. Medieval recipes and household accounts mention using virtually every part of every slaughtered animal. Spleens, pancreases, brains, testicles, hearts, kidneys, and organs that modern eaters wouldn't even recognize. This wasn't culinary adventurousness. It was economic necessity driven by the fundamental reality that protein was too precious to waste. Animal heads were particularly valuable because they contained multiple types of food in one package. A pig's head could be boiled for hours to create a rich, gelatinous broth while the meat was picked from the skull. The brain could be scrambled or fried. The tongue, considered a delicacy even among the poor, provided tender meat with a unique texture. Even the eyes and other soft tissues were consumed when food was scarce enough. The blood from slaughter was never wasted, being immediately processed into blood pudding or blood sausage. Mixed with grain meal, fat, and whatever seasonings were available, blood provided iron and protein while helping to stretch limited food supplies. The resulting sausages were dense, dark, and had a distinctive metallic flavor that took some getting used to, but provided substantial nutrition. As you finish your portion of liver, licking the last fatty juices from your fingers with the thoroughness of someone who understands the value of every calorie, a deep, satisfying warmth spreads through your body. This isn't just the physical sensation of having eaten. It's the feeling of proper nutrition reaching tissues that have been starved for essential nutrients. Your body seems to sigh with relief as proteins, vitamins, and minerals begin circulating through your system. For the first time in months, you feel not just full, but nourished. There's a qualitative difference between having your stomach occupied by bulk, the usual result of pottage meals, and having it filled with nutrient-dense food that your body can actually use. The liver provides concentrated doses of vitamin A, iron, B vitamins, and complete proteins that your grain-based diet utterly lacks. You watch your children as they eat their portions, seeing color return to their cheeks, energy return to their movements, and alertness return to their eyes. The transformation isn't immediate or miraculous, but it's noticeable enough to give you hope that they might survive the continuing food shortage with their health intact. The irony of the situation isn't lost on you. You're eating the Lord's garbage with more gratitude and satisfaction than he'll feel consuming his elaborate wedding feast. The organs that were deemed unworthy of his table have provided your family with better nutrition than you've had in months. This reversal of values, where the discarded becomes precious and the precious becomes commonplace, perfectly encapsulates the bizarre economics of medieval food distribution. But this feast of offal is a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. Tomorrow you'll return to your baseline diet of pottage and bread. The memory of rich, fatty liver will fade, but it will sustain you psychologically through the long months ahead. You've been reminded that real food exists, that your body can feel strong and satisfied, that there are meals worth anticipating rather than simply enduring. For one evening, you weren't just surviving on subsistence rations. You were feasting on concentrated nutrition that most modern people would turn away from in disgust. The fact that this feast consisted of what wealthy people considered waste makes it all the more precious. You've turned refuse into sustenance, scraps into salvation. As you settle down for the night, your stomach finally quiet for the first time in months, you understand something fundamental about medieval life. Abundance and scarcity exist side by side, separated not by geography or season, but by the rigid boundaries of social class. Tonight, those boundaries worked briefly in your favor, and that makes all the difference. The memory of the awful feast fades as your diet returns to its grim baseline, and with it comes a new terror lurking in your daily bread. Your primary grain is rye, a hardy, resilient crop that grows where wheat fails, perfect for your region's poor soil and harsh climate. The dense, dark loaves that sustain you have a strong, sour flavor that you've come to associate with survival itself. But this humble rye bread carries within it a microscopic horror that can transform your village into a scene from your worst nightmares. It begins subtly, as the most insidious threats often do. A neighbor, a man you've known your entire life, someone who's helped you with harvests and shared tools during difficult times, starts complaining about strange sensations in his extremities. At first he dismisses it as the cold, winter's bite affecting his circulation, but the tingling in his fingers and toes persists and grows worse, developing into a burning sensation that he describes in increasingly desperate terms as fire running through his veins. Within days, his wife begins experiencing the same symptoms, followed by their children. Soon, the entire family is writhing in agony, screaming about flames that consume them from within, while their bodies show no external signs of burning. Their cries echo through the village at night, keeping everyone awake and filling the community with a dread that has no name and no obvious cause. This is the first stage of what medieval people called ignis sacer, the holy fire, or St. Anthony's fire. Today we know it as ergotism, a condition caused by consuming grain contaminated with a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, commonly known as ergot. This isn't just food poisoning in any conventional sense. It's a pharmacological nightmare that can cause hallucinations, gangrene, convulsions, and death. Ergot thrives on cereal grasses, especially rye, under very specific conditions: cold, wet winters, followed by warm, moist springs. These are exactly the conditions you've just experienced, thanks to the increasingly erratic weather patterns of the Little Ice Age. The fungus infects the developing grain heads, replacing normal rye kernels with hard, purplish-black structures called sclerotia that look like elongated mouse droppings or diseased grain. When your rye is harvested, these toxic ergot bodies are often gathered along with the healthy grain. Your small-scale, non-industrial farming methods offer no technology to separate them out effectively. The ergot sclerotia are simply milled along with the rest of the grain, poisoning the entire batch of flour with a complex cocktail of alkaloids that attack the human nervous system and cardiovascular system. The bread you've been eating every day for weeks has been laced with this toxic mixture, and now you're watching the poison reveal its true nature in your neighbor's suffering. The alkaloids in ergot, compounds with names like lysergic acid, ergotamine, and ergonovine, constrict blood vessels throughout the body, cutting off circulation to the extremities. Your neighbor's hands and feet begin to swell as blood flow is restricted, then turn purple as oxygen deprivation sets in. As the poisoning progresses, the affected limbs turn black as the tissue dies from lack of circulation. The skin becomes dry, leathery, and mummified while still attached to the living person. In the most horrifying cases, the gangrenous extremities can break off with minimal force, leaving behind clean stumps that bleed surprisingly little, because the blood vessels have been so completely constricted. This form of the disease comes to be known as gangrenous ergotism, and watching it progress is like witnessing a living person slowly turn to stone. But there's another version of this nightmare, one that might be even more terrifying to witness. In a different household, a family that has been eating from the same batch of contaminated bread experiences something entirely different. They're not screaming from physical pain, but from psychological terror. They see demons in their smoke-filled hovel, speak of monstrous creatures crawling on their skin, and suffer from violent convulsions that contort their bodies into impossible positions. This is convulsive ergotism, caused by different alkaloids in the ergot affecting the central nervous system rather than the cardiovascular system. The victims experience powerful hallucinations that are often terrifying in nature. They might see the walls of their home crawling with insects, believe that their neighbors have been replaced by evil spirits, or feel convinced that they're being attacked by invisible monsters. These aren't mild visual disturbances. They're complete breaks with reality that can last for days or weeks. The convulsions themselves are violent and unpredictable. A person might be sitting normally one moment, and then suddenly arch backward in an impossible position, their muscles contracting with such force that bones can break. The seizures are often accompanied by a characteristic cry or shriek that can be heard throughout the village, adding to the atmosphere of supernatural terror that surrounds ergot poisoning. The village priest, witnessing these symptoms and having no understanding of fungal toxins, can only conclude that divine punishment has struck the community. Drawing on religious tradition, he identifies the condition as St. Anthony's fire, named after the Christian hermit St. Anthony of Egypt, whose intercession was sought by sufferers of various diseases. The saint's name becomes attached to ergotism because of the burning sensations victims experience, and because of Anthony's legendary struggles with demonic temptations, struggles that seem to mirror the hallucinations and psychological torment of ergot poisoning. Religious responses to ergot outbreaks often involve organizing pilgrimages to shrines containing St. Anthony's relics, and here's where historical irony reveals itself. These pilgrimages sometimes actually work to cure the condition, not through divine intervention, but through simple geography. Making the journey to a distant shrine meant leaving home and, crucially, leaving behind the contaminated bread that was causing the poisoning. At pilgrimage destinations, travelers were typically fed by monks or other charitable organizations, usually with wheat bread rather than rye. Wheat doesn't support ergot growth as readily as rye, so pilgrims would unknowingly remove themselves from the source of poisoning. Their symptoms would gradually disappear over the course of days or weeks, reinforcing belief in the saint's miraculous healing power. The cure was real, even if the explanation was wrong. Some historians have controversially suggested that ergot poisoning might explain some of history's most famous cases of mass hysteria and supernatural accusations. The Salem witch trials of 1692-1693 occurred in a community that relied heavily on rye cultivation, and the symptoms described by the accusers, convulsions, hallucinations, sensations of being pinched or bitten by invisible attackers, match perfectly with convulsive ergotism. While this theory remains hotly debated, it illustrates the profound impact that ergot poisoning could have on entire communities. The psychological effects of ergot alkaloids can be particularly devastating in a medieval context because they often involve religious or supernatural themes. Victims might believe they're being tormented by demons, visited by angels, or receiving divine visions. In a society that takes spiritual experiences very seriously, distinguishing between genuine religious experience and fungal poisoning becomes nearly impossible. Living with the constant threat of ergot contamination creates a new layer of anxiety in your already difficult existence. Every loaf of bread on your table becomes suspect. You inspect your bread carefully, looking for the telltale dark kernels that might indicate ergot contamination, but the sclerotia are ground into the flour during milling, making them invisible to casual inspection. The very staff of life has become a potential agent of madness and death. Every minor physical sensation takes on ominous significance. A tingling in your fingers could be the beginning of ergot poisoning, or it could just be cold weather affecting your circulation. A strange dream might be the early onset of ergot-induced hallucinations, or it could simply be your mind processing the stresses of daily survival. The uncertainty is as torturous as the disease itself. Your family develops informal protocols for monitoring each other's health, watching for early signs of ergot poisoning so that consumption of contaminated bread can be stopped before permanent damage occurs. Children are taught to report any unusual sensations immediately. Adults become hypervigilant about each other's behavior, looking for signs of the mental disturbances that accompany convulsive ergotism. But stopping consumption of contaminated bread isn't always an option when bread represents your primary source of calories. If your entire grain supply is contaminated, a distinct possibility when ergot affects whole fields rather than individual plants, you face an impossible choice between slow starvation and potential poisoning. Some families choose to eat contaminated bread anyway, gambling that the ergot levels aren't high enough to cause severe symptoms, or hoping that they can survive on reduced rations until clean grain becomes available. The economic impact of ergot contamination extends far beyond individual households. When entire communities are affected, agricultural productivity plummets as people become unable to work effectively. Fields go untended, animals go unfed, and the basic maintenance of medieval life becomes impossible when significant portions of the population are either incapacitated by poisoning or caring for those who are. Trade relationships suffer as communities become reluctant to accept grain from regions known to have ergot problems. The reputation of particular mills or growing areas can be destroyed by ergot outbreaks, creating economic hardships that persist long after the immediate health crisis has passed. Some communities develop elaborate testing and inspection protocols to try to identify contaminated grain before it's processed into flour, but these methods are imperfect at best. The seasonal nature of ergot contamination creates a cycle of dread that follows the agricultural calendar. The conditions that promote ergot growth, wet springs following cold winters, become harbingers of potential disaster. Farmers learn to watch their rye fields with growing anxiety as the grain heads develop, looking for the telltale dark sclerotia among the normal kernels. But identification in the field doesn't guarantee prevention. Ergot sclerotia can be difficult to distinguish from normal rye in certain light conditions or stages of development. Even when contamination is spotted, the decision of whether to harvest the field becomes agonizing. A completely contaminated field might be abandoned entirely, representing the loss of a year's work and food for the winter. A partially contaminated field might be harvested with the hope that careful processing can separate the good grain from the bad, but this separation is often imperfect. The storage and processing of potentially contaminated grain creates additional opportunities for the poison to spread through the food supply. Ergot sclerotia are harder and more durable than normal grain, meaning they can survive storage conditions that might destroy other contaminants. During milling, the tough sclerosia might not break down as completely as normal grain, leading to concentrated pockets of ergot alkaloids in certain portions of the flour. Medieval millers, already suspected of adulterating flour for profit, now face the additional challenge of potentially being blamed for ergot poisoning, even when the contamination originates in the fields rather than in their processing. The social trust that's essential for community food systems begins to break down as people become suspicious of anyone involved in grain production or processing. Your daily bread, the foundation of your diet, the symbol of basic sustenance, the food that connects you to the land and the seasons, has become a potential source of unimaginable suffering. The staff of life has transformed into a poisoned chalice that you have no choice but to keep consuming, praying that each bite won't be the one that ignites the holy fire in your veins or opens the gates to madness in your mind. Every meal becomes a gamble with odds you can't calculate and consequences you can barely imagine. The bread that should nourish you might instead destroy your sanity, cost you your limbs, or slowly burn you alive from the inside out. And yet you eat it anyway, because the alternative, starvation, offers only the certainty of death rather than the mere possibility of it. This is the ultimate betrayal of the medieval food system. Even the most basic, essential foods could turn against you without warning, transforming survival into a deadly game of chance where the house always held the advantage. And so, our long, disturbing journey through the worst food in human history finally comes to an end. We can step away from the smoky hovels and cold manor halls, leaving behind the world of perpetual pottage, poisonous bread, and ergot-induced nightmares. The memories of gritty gruel and rancid preserved meat can fade as you return to the simple, clean comfort of your own time. Take a moment to appreciate the gentle hum of your refrigerator, that miracle of modern technology that keeps decay at bay with quiet, constant vigilance. Consider the clear glass of water you can drink without fear, a luxury that would have seemed impossible to achieve in the world we've just explored. Think about the abundance of choices that await you in your own kitchen. Fresh foods from around the globe, spices used to enhance rather than mask flavors, preservatives that actually preserve rather than merely disguise rot. The sharp pangs of medieval hunger and the garish excess of noble feasts are softening now, becoming historical curiosities rather than immediate realities. You're safe in an era where food is generally clean, nutritious, and designed to taste good rather than simply prevent death. Where bread doesn't contain sand or sawdust, where meat doesn't need to be hidden under layers of expensive spices to mask its decay, where drinking water won't give you dysentery. Medieval people survived on food that was actively hostile to their health and happiness. They used preservation methods that eliminated flavor along with bacteria, followed medical advice that was not just wrong but often dangerous, and lived within social systems that treated food as a weapon of class warfare. Their entire culinary experience was shaped by scarcity, fear, and the daily struggle to consume enough calories to survive while avoiding the numerous ways that food could kill them. You live in a time when vast networks of professionals work to ensure your food is safe, nutritious, and pleasant to consume, where regulations protect you from the kind of systematic adulteration that was routine in medieval markets, where medical science understands nutrition well enough to prevent the deficiency diseases that plagued our ancestors, where the simple act of eating can be a pleasure rather than an ordeal. The medieval world now seems impossibly distant, a cautionary tale of what happens when every aspect of food production, distribution, and consumption goes wrong simultaneously and repeatedly. It's a reminder of how much human ingenuity and social progress has been required to transform eating from a dangerous necessity into one of life's reliable pleasures. Your next meal, whatever it might be, represents the accumulated knowledge and effort of thousands of years of human development. It's a small miracle that medieval people could barely imagine, food that's safe, abundant, and genuinely enjoyable to eat. Rest well tonight, knowing that the age of ergot poisoning and adulterated bread has passed into history. The pottage pot has gone cold, the corrupt millers have been replaced by regulated food systems, and the simple act of eating no longer requires gambling with your life. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this exploration of humanity's most unappetizing chapter. Tomorrow, you'll wake to a world where breakfast is a pleasure rather than a potentially deadly gamble, and that's something worth savoring.